If you want to play the opening stage well in the game of chess, knowing the moves is not enough. You have to know the reasons behind them. In today's video, I'd like to share top 10 ideas in the French defense for the black pieces and explain you the reasons, the why part behind those moves. Let's start somewhere simple at the fundamentals. Number one idea in today's video is going to be c7 to c5 pawn break. In the advanced variation of the French defense, white has just played e5. Now, first thing to understand is that white is grabbing the space over here, and if you're not going to be countering them and just be developing pieces in a natural way, soon in the middle game, they're going to be having an attack on that side of the board. So what you have to do is retaliate, and this pawn move immediately creates a strategic threat. So for example, if your opponent plays a move like knight to f3, which does not extend the pawn chain, you want to truncate it right away with c takes d4. Now what that does, it first of all weakens the pawn on e5. So there's no d4 pawn that right now is going to protect it, and playing f2 to f4 will have long-term consequences against the white's king. You could imagine if later you get a chance to take over that diagonal, you can create some tactical ideas against the white's king. Now in this position, simple knight c6 would be enough, so you're immediately applying pressure against the knight, but I like to play the move knight to e7. The idea behind it is that soon I want to play knight c6, and if they do take, I want to take back with the other knight. So for example, most popular move would be bishop d3, now we can play knight to c6, and after the trade, you could see the reason why I placed the knight over there. Now in this position, very often opponents will play bishop f4, which is not a good move in my opinion. It's a natural move, they're developing a piece while guarding that, but here is a trick. Queen to b6, we're targeting the pawn on b2. And a very common error here for the white pieces would be playing b3. After all, now the pawn is no longer hanging, but queen to d4 wins a piece. So the rook is hanging in the corner, and the bishop is also attacked on c5. So just remember that after white plays e5, your big strategic goal is to play c5 and start exerting pressure on the white center. And in this position, the way white should play is pawn to c3, which is connecting right now the pawn chain. And in case you're going to be taking here, white still maintains the pawn on d4, which solidifies that pawn on e5 for now. The good thing for black, though, in this position is that black is the first to develop the pieces. And so we're hoping that the initiative we're going to develop on the queen side is going to prevent them later attacking our king on the king side. Now we go to idea number 2. Now imagine that you already have exchanged your c pawn for the white's d pawn. In such situations, a very common way to fight against the pawn on e5 is not only by applying pressure against it with pieces, but also playing the pawn move to f6. You're trying to exchange the very pawn that is giving them that space advantage on the king side. In this position, the pawn is attacked too heavily, and so white is going to take back. And now we're entering this kind of interesting situation where white has no pawns in the center anymore. Your dream as black, of course, would be at some point to play the pawn move to e5. That would free up the bishop and also overwhelmingly attack the white's minor pieces in the center of the board. The reason why this move f6 is more commonly played in French rather than other openings is because our light square bishop stayed inside. Now, when we played f6, we cleared the path for white to put some pressure against the pawn on e6. But in French, that bishop from c8 is going to keep an eye on that, in quotes, weakness of ours. So for example, castles and castles is a very common scenario. And here it's imperative to understand that both players are fighting for the square on e5. White's dream is to establish a piece on that square and be able to maintain it there, while black hopes to push at some point that pawn further into e5, further into the white's territory. And here there is a very common error that white plays, which is rook e1. Who doesn't want to develop the piece and apply the pressure against the backward pawn? And there is a shocker, e5 actually tactically works, because after white takes and black takes, in this position we have knight to g4. And now we have triple pressure on f2, plus it comes with fork if I take with bishop. As you can see, the rook and the king is going to be under attack, and black is doing fantastically in this position. So the second idea is the pawn break f6. Now, the fourth idea comes with the pressure on d4 and development of the king side. So in this position, one of the most popular ways for black to play is to take on d4, which now defines the pawn there. Now, the drawback in general of this move is that now it allows white to come with the knight to c3. Now, the black's development usually involves knight out first, and then knight routes to f5 square, and then our dark square bishop comes later. I always remind my students that you don't want to come out with the knight first, because you're going to be preventing the bishop from defending that pawn on c5, which I don't want my students to be dealing with. So we take first, and then we go knight e7. And a very common move here, which is an error by white, would be simply to castle. And that would allow the black's knight to come to f5. And there is no way to save the pawn on d4, because if they're going to be defending this with the bishop, for example, bishop to e3, now this pawn on b2 is hanging and we could take it. The fifth idea that is very important to know is how to deal with a very strong move of white's, positionally, the move a3. They're intending to later expand with b4, if necessary, place the bishop on b2 to have a better defense over the square on d4. In this position, we finally can actually play the move c4. If the pawn was on a2 backwards, c4 would be a terrible blunder, because then white would be able to play pawn to b3, take away this pawn of c4, and have an overwhelming central control. However, in this position, it's possible. White is simply unable to play for the pawn move b3. For example, if they're going to be playing knight to d2, we have a very typical move, which might look weird, knight a5. The position is closed, and the knight here is not dim on the rim. We are looking at that b3 square specifically. And if white is very stubborn, for example, they want to play rook b1, and now they're preparing b3 again, we have a very beautiful idea of playing bishop to d7, so that even if they were to play b3, soon that bishop from here could come to a4, and black is just absolutely fine. So white was unable to create any counterplay that is dangerous for black on the queen side. So it turns out that in this position going back, black managed, at least for now, to close down the queen side. And this allows black to castle the other way. Very often we have long maneuvers over here where the bishop comes to d7, queen side castling, king b8, the knight routes to squares like b6 and even a4. But most importantly, your counterplay is often going to be connected to attacking on that side of the board, because you're going to castle queen side. You lock down the queen side, that's where your king is going to be safe, and you're going to be trying to attack on the other side of the board. So c4 is a very big idea that can only be usually played after white has played a3, because b3 is no longer dangerous. The sixth idea is dealing with our light square bishop. Very often I hear people saying that French is worse than the Caro-Kann because of the positioning of the light square bishop. Well, first thing to say is that because we're not wasting time developing that light square bishop, and we get c5 much quicker, in French defense we get the initiative much more often than in openings like Caro-Kann. And I've heard grandmasters who are world-known experts of the French defense saying that they think the bishop on c8 is actually the best piece that black has, because once it starts playing, usually black is doing very, very well. The typical two ways of getting that bishop into the game would be bishop d7, bishop b5. And the other way, I will show you a deep middle game where black used the pawn to f6 or f5, and then the bishop can see the light on one of these diagonals. So for example, in this position, black skipped the move knight to c6, and instead can just play bishop d7. Next move, we can go bishop b5, and it's a way of playing for black, and that bishop becomes alive. In this example, we have Jose Raul Capablanca playing with the black pieces, and it would be possible to make seemingly a very bad bishop play again by placing our king back on f8 and then routing this bishop to this amazing diagonal to the square h5. The seventh idea that I would like to show you is how to break the symmetry and play the exchange variation of the French defense for a win. First of all, we're going to not copy them by developing our knight to f6, and we're going to be placing our bishop on d6. And the big idea is that after typical bishop d3, we're not going to be mirroring them and playing knight to f6 again, but instead we're going to play knight to c6. Very often our light square bishop will come to squares like g4. Our knight is going to come to e7 to block the checks, or later to prepare the move bishop f5, and then we later hope to be able to castle queenside. So take a look at what kind of interesting positions we're getting, which are not typical for the classical variations of the French defense of exchange variation. And very often you can lift the queen and simply casting the other way. Now it's anyone's game. You're going to be preparing all kinds of kingside attacks with pawn storms. And this is a way with the black pieces to play seemingly drawish variation, exchange one, for the win with the black pieces. The eighth idea is a common error that I would like you to not play in a popular variation of the French defense called the Tarrasch, where white deliberately placed their knight on the square d2. A very common error in such positions is to move the knight to f6. This will simply allow white to develop the initiative when the rook is going to come to e1. So for example, a lot of online games follow this path, like white castles, we'll have bishop to e7 by black, and now white is taking the pawn on c5. We know that if we're going to take this pawn, then we'll allow initiative with the check. Then after bishop e6, there is knight g5 soon coming. First, they can get a tempo with knight to b3. Say we go back to b6. And after knight d4, this is double attacked and this is double attacked. It just looks ugly for black. Now then you might be thinking, all right, I will first, after they take this pawn, castles, and then I'm going to be regaining the pawn with bishop c5. But they can place their knight on the square b3, and it's going to be very difficult for you to be regaining that pawn. So as you can see, this is quite dangerous position for black, and knight f6 is just not the way to go. There are a couple of ways out. One is to play the bishop to d6 and knight to e7. That looks very normal, as rook e1 is no longer going to be dangerous. Or you could play the move queen to e7, which is even more fun. So you're usually either exchanging the queens and pulling the light square bishop back home, or the bishop just goes back, after which you can place your queen on c7 and now develop normally even with knight to f6. For example, like say castles, knight to f6, rook e1. We can take on d4. There are no discovered checks that are dangerous here for black. And now you get the castled king, safe position, typical classical isolated pawn position with only a slight advantage for white. The next two ideas are going to be covering how to deal with trap or weird lines from white's point of view that black often are dealing with incorrectly. Namely, one is queen e2. This looks awkward, and so many players just follow on the path of playing d5, which is actually not a good move. You see, the point of queen e2 is that now your e-pawn is sort of pinned. And so if you play d5, after taking, you cannot take with the pawn. So that means that after you take with the queen, now white can win a tempo against her. And there is a very common path where black was very wrong. First of all, white is already better. And then if we're just playing typical moves for the black pieces, white will play this plan of castling queenside, and the position becomes very dangerous for black. So what I recommend on move 2 here after queen e2 would be probably to play bishop e7, because then you're going to get French-like structure. The point is that now there is no pin anymore. And if they play, for example, knight f3, you can play d5. And if they take, you can finally take back with the pawn. And there is another move here that you could play, which is c5. But then you might be getting some positions that are resembling the Sicilian defense. If you're comfortable with that, go for it. Last but not least, I would like to teach you how to deal with a very common gambit in Blitz games online when you take the pawn on e4 and they play f3. If you're going to be taking the pawn on f3, they're going to know exactly how to develop the pieces and develop the initiative in the middle game. My recommended move over here is bishop to b4, and I get a lot of players in trouble here when I'm black. So they're going to just take the pawn back, which is an error because now you have queen h4. And what's funny is this pawn actually is not protected because you have the pin on the knight. So if they play g3, that means they're losing the rook in the corner. And typically they have to move the king into the center. And you could just see this position is absolute chocolate for black. thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider hiring me as your personal online chess coach, and I will see you in the next lesson. Bye bye.